Hello everyone, and welcome to our guide on migration to AWS. Presenting today, my name is Jeff Farnes. I'm a Senior Cloud Architect at Basefarm. Some quick information for you. You'll find on your screen a copy of our white paper on the left if you want to download a copy of that for later viewing. And if you'd like to ask any questions or provide us any feedback, you'll find at the bottom a number of different ways to contact us and talk about this webinar. So who am I, and what qualifies me to talk to you today about AWS, and particularly to migrating to AWS? Well, as I said, my name is Jeff Barnett. I'm a Senior Cloud Architect at Basefarm, and I work for the Professional Services team here in Sweden. I joined Basefarm in May 2019, so this year, and I actually work with all the clouds. So I hold 4 different certifications in AWS, and I also hold certifications with 2 of the other major cloud providers as well. I support customers primarily with cloud strategy, migration, but I also help customers reduce costs by optimizing their services on various cloud platforms. So let's get down to business. So the first thing that we always want to talk about when we're talking about cloud migration is actually what are your drivers for migration. It's really important for customers to understand, what their key drivers are. Some people have contractual drivers, so they are, ending a, long-term support agreement with an existing supplier. They could be needing to move out of an existing space, so they currently have a co-hosting agreement or they're renting data center space from somebody, and the contract's coming to an end and they need to vacate. So you have a time then sensitive kind of need to do migration, and you could be subject to significant financial penalties if you are not able to migrate within that amount of time. Other customers, so they're looking for performance and security benefits. So maybe the capacity of the existing solution isn't able to scale to where you want to go. You're expecting an increase in the number of users that are accessing your service, or you have like peaks and troughs in your service, so you want to be able to flex your capacity. Maybe you have poor reliability, or at the moment you're worried about your security infrastructure not being able to keep up with the latest requirements that you have with your regulators. Another reason that you might want to migrate could be about the perceived benefits of cloud. Maybe you want to reduce costs, or you want to transition from a CapEx model to an OpEx model, so that you're renting services rather than purchasing them. Maybe you want to take advantage of flexible capacity on demand, reduce your management overhead, or start to manage your infrastructure as code rather than using manual methods or scripts. But one of the other key benefits of moving to cloud is actually being able to use the cloud as an engine for innovation, so taking advantage of the services available in the cloud to help you move and innovate more quickly. So if you're already starting to think that migrating to cloud would be a good idea, let's talk about what challenges we might face in our ability to move there. The first thing could be obviously our human resourcing requirement. Maybe your IT organization is already stretched and maintain the current infrastructure, and you don't have that overhead to be able to implement the change that you need to migrate to cloud. Maybe your development teams are already prioritizing existing changes to business functionality in your applications. Or maybe your application development is performed by a third party, so changing your application or modifying it for the cloud has a significant cost overhead for you. Other challenges could be financial, moving from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. If your finance department is used to using the CapEx model and it's used to being able to stretch assets for a long amount of time and keep OpEx down, then obviously moving to an operational model is going to significantly affect the financial structure of the way that your company could operate. And while it may provide much better total cost of ownership, if you are currently focusing on driving down operational costs, then you need to be very aware that this will do the opposite. You need to also look at, software licensing. Your existing software licenses could have restrictions that may prevent you from moving those licenses to the cloud. If you've got Microsoft licenses, for example, and you've not kept up with the software assurance aspect, then it might limit your ability to move the licenses to the cloud or to use them in the most effective ways. And there could be restrictions on your licenses that are tied to physical cores or sockets, or other licensing models that depend on physical aspects of equipment that can actually prevent you being able to move those licenses. There's also a financial impact of service outages. You need to look at greatly at what changes will happen in terms of your SLAs. A third challenge is obviously your organizational buy-in. Is your management already bought into the idea of moving to public cloud? Is public cloud migration or moving to use public cloud services part of your overall IT strategy? Is there sponsorship from your CXO level? And has the business case been prepared already for moving to public cloud? Do you know that it's going to give you benefits? And the other thing is, does everybody in your organization understand, the benefits that you're trying to achieve by moving to public cloud? Because if they don't, then they can stand in the way of you actually doing your migration. So when customers start their migration projects, there's usually an imperative that straight away you need to set out and set in stone your project plan for the migration project. And what I like to do is basically tell you not to do that. You should think about definitely planning the early stages of your project. You want to be able to plan the creation of your Cloud Center of Excellence, and you want to be able to plan the discovery phase where you're going into your existing environment and gathering the information about it. But what you don't want to do is start to plan already the migration stints and phases that you're going to do, because right now you haven't decided what is the best option in terms of how to migrate your applications, whether you are going to lift and shift those applications or whether you're going to do some light transformation on them or maybe rewrite them. So until you've actually decided what you're going to do about each of these applications, it makes no sense right now to actually plan the migration phase. However, if you do have a time-sensitive delivery and you need to close down a data center or you need to exit a contract by a specific date, then obviously you need to put this milestone in your plan to make sure that you have everything completed before then. And actually having this kind of time-sensitive delivery can actually affect which options are available to you in terms of migration, because you want to, in this case, choose the much more time-efficient parts for doing the migration up front. However, migrating to the cloud platform is not the end of the migration project. You still need to do work after you've actually got off of your existing platform. And this is why I would say, don't think right now about when the project will end straight away, but do plan in any key dates that you have. When it comes to planning the Cloud Center of Excellence, one thing you need to do is make sure you set that up, and that is in your project plan and very early. Make sure you have experts with knowledge of the applications that you have in your business, understand your business processes and how the applications support them and what's affected in your business processes if you lose access to these applications. And make sure that you have some knowledge of the target cloud platform that you're moving to, in this case AWS, and in particular the services on AWS that you plan to use. Before you migrate any workloads to AWS, one of the things you need to make sure that you have prepared is your landing zone. Now, landing zone is a term that we use in the industry to talk about the place where you land your applications, and it consists of your AWS organizations, your accounts, your identity and access management systems, and your users and groups, any VPCs and subnets that you're going to build to support your applications. So if you're going to connect existing networks to on-premise networks or to that you have currently, security policies that you want to apply to the environment, and then operations management infrastructure that allow you to monitor and proactively ensure that your environment is secure and operating correctly. You also need to make sure that you have the security operations infrastructure in place and that your security logging functions are in place before you move the workloads. And any connectivity that you need to have to existing on-premise solutions or existing data centers need to be put in place, whether that is using Direct Connect or a virtual private network. And because I'm talking about landing zone right now, one of the things I also want to talk to you about is infrastructure as code. And you should absolutely build your landing zone using an infrastructure as code tool. And anything that you build on AWS, wherever possible, should be defined in code. We actually have two options for doing infrastructure as code on AWS. There's the AWS native option or CloudFormation, and you also have the option of HashiCorp Terraform. Now here in Basefarm, we tend to use Terraform for pretty much everything that we build on AWS or any other cloud. And one of the key benefits of using Terraform is that it's cross-platform. And we can actually coordinate the deployment of resources across several different cloud platforms or on-premise solutions using Terraform. And it can build those things, managing the dependencies between them. AWS CloudFormation is entirely native to AWS, which means it has really great support for AWS services natively. And both of these tools, they're desired state engines. So if you define something in a template, it will set the configuration of that object. If you remove an object from the template, it will delete that object from AWS. If you update the configuration of the object, then it will update that object in AWS. And if it can't update it, it will delete it and recreate it with the new configuration objects. Both of the tools don't support every single service in AWS, but they support most services, and the support is increasing all the time. You can find many examples of both CloudFormation and Terraform templates online. AWS has CloudFormation quick starts, and they're available from AWS and from partners in the community. And Terraform has a massive Terraform library from various community sources that you can use. So let's go back to migration, and let's talk about the migration process that we need to follow when we're looking at getting our applications from wherever they are currently into AWS. So the first thing that we want to do is that we want to perform a discovery and analysis phase. So for this, we want to deploy some tooling out to the environment and gather some information about our existing virtual machines, our existing servers, and our existing applications within the estate. We also want to look at other information that we have, what documentation that we have, what information that we have about licensing, and we want to use all of that information together to determine, first of all, how are we going to migrate that application to AWS, or are we going to actually migrate the application to AWS. And we use a process called the 6 R's methodology to actually determine which form of migration we will actually take. And the 6 R's stands for rehost, replatform, repurchase, refactor, some people say re-architect instead of refactor, retain, or retire. And when we look at rehosting, what we actually look to do is that we actually look to rebuild the application exactly as it is on AWS. And in some cases, this involves using a migration tool to actually just move the VM as it is and convert it and run it on AWS. So we don't even reinstall the application. But a much more preferred method is actually we do a reinstallation of that VM. And wherever we can, we use automated tooling to actually recreate that VM in a stable manner on AWS and then migrate the data afterwards. But if we absolutely have to, then maybe we would do a manual installation. And one reason that you might do a manual installation could be if you have an external application vendor that insists on installing the application themselves as part of your maintenance contract, in which case you do as much automation as possible. So you create the actual instance using infrastructure as code, and then you hand over the virtual machine to your third-party provider, and they can do the manual install and config and whatever data migration tests are required. Our next option is replatform. And when we do replatforming, what we're actually going to look at is how we can slightly optimize the existing application to work a little bit better in the cloud. And that could be a case of upgrading the operating system to something that's slightly more modern. Maybe we know it's going to go out of support soon. It could also mean that we are going to look at using some cloud services. So we could move a database, for example, from our own instance that we manage ourselves onto like a managed service like Amazon Relational Database Service, or we could look at using one of the Amazon storage options, such as Amazon S3, to store data for our application. So what we do then is that we modify the application slightly, or we use different configuration options on the application's installation in order to optimize it better for the cloud. And we could also do things like introducing Amazon's elastic load balancers to help us auto-scale the application. Our third option is to repurchase. So if we know that the application is perhaps old and it's not supported anymore, or if we think that there's a better option to replace it, so it would not be economical to move it to AWS or to keep it where it is, then we could actually select a different product and replace our application with that. We might purchase a SaaS product that doesn't run on AWS or that could run on AWS, or we could buy another off-the-shelf product and redeploy that on AWS instead. Our fourth option is refactor. And as I said, some people call this re-architect, so refactor or re-architect. I always like to think of refactoring as taking existing code and then trying to recomposite the application from the existing code base onto a new platform. So maybe we try and reuse as much existing code as possible. And I think of re-architecting as starting from scratch, but then re-engineering all the processes that the application currently has in a new code base. But whichever is the case, we end up rebuilding the application and re-architecting it on a new platform in a more cloud-native fashion. Our fifth and sixth options actually don't involve us moving anything to AWS at all. So our retain option is that we keep the application where it is, on-premise in the existing location. And if we do that, then we should set a date for review. You know, are we going to continue operating that application like that forever, or at some point are we going to replace it or look at some other way of moving it or moving the business function supported by that application? And our last option is retire. And if we're going to retire an application, then we need to set the date for decommissioning, and we need to decommission it. And in some cases, that might also mean that we need to migrate data elsewhere. Once we've actually completed the process of migrating the application and its data, we also then need to validate that the fact that that was successful. So we need some form of testing to ensure that the application is functioning correctly, and then we need to move that the support of that application into our operational stage. So let's talk a little bit more about discovery and analysis. So at the very beginning of our migration project, we need to do discovery of our existing estate. We need to get as much information as we can about our existing applications and what we have in our existing estate in order to prepare ourselves for the migration. So we have a number of tools that we can use for discovery. We can use the AWS Discovery Agent. We can use the AWS Discovery Collector if we have a VMware environment. And we can also use third-party tools like Cloudemize to actually gather information about our existing applications and get inventory information and dependency mapping. We can also use existing configuration management database tools, although in my experience, most CMDB tools tend to have a lot of data which is either out of date or incorrect. And we can also use existing documentation. And again, my experience with documentation is that often it doesn't reflect the live environment and hasn't been kept up to date. But we do have these options to be able to enrich our picture of those applications. After we've discovered as much data as we can and we've placed out any agents that we want to use, we can then use an analysis phase to actually look at how we might optimize and move those workloads into the cloud. So we can use tools in the AWS Migration Hub to actually provide us recommendations about what instance sizes we should use if we were to do a straightforward migration. We can also use tools like Cloudemize to actually give us, again, instance recommendations and actually right-sizing recommendations. So if an instance is over-provisioned, then we can also actually look at shrinking that VM down so that we're optimizing for cost. And we can also perform manual analysis. So we can look at the data that we've collected and we can manually make estimates if we want to. If we want to get recommendations, so this is about right-sizing VM. So maybe we've over-provisioned somewhere. Maybe we could use a service in a better way. Then we can use tools in the AWS Migration Hub or in Cloudemize to actually give that to us. And these will give us some automated recommendations. But we need to make the decisions about whether we're going to take those recommendations into account. So a few moments ago, I talked to you about the rehost option within the 6Rs migration pattern. And one of the options that is available under rehost is the ability to migrate a VM from your existing environment, if that's a VMware environment or Hyper-V environment, to AWS. Now, a lot of customers want to do this because it actually saves you a lot of effort in terms of being able to move your existing VMs to the cloud. You know that the VM will be exactly the same as it was on-premise, and it will be able to function in exactly the same way. However, there are several reasons why you might want to rebuild those VMs instead. And one of those reasons is to do with the quality and consistency of those virtual machines. So if you've manually built those virtual machines on-premise, you're going to bring any problems that you have about inconsistency or build quality to AWS. And moving to AWS, the migration project, is a great time to actually start with best practices like introducing things like infrastructure as code and scripted installations. So if you don't move if you do migrate your VMs to AWS, then you are going to be stuck with those same processes that you have today. And it's going to be much more difficult to actually verify that the application is working if you don't know the current state of the application. So if you have lost track of how the configuration in your application actually works, you still won't know that once you've moved to AWS. Now, using infrastructure as code to rebuild the VMs is actually a great method. It is a great thing to do because you can actually version control your infrastructure as code. So if you make a change, you can actually roll those changes back. You're always going to know the state of your environment if you're going to do this, so it means it's great for configuration management. And if you need to create any replicas for testing, then you can also do that too, because you can take the existing templates that you've created from your infrastructure as code library and actually re-roll those elsewhere and build exactly the same thing over and over again. When we also talk about the moving your VMs, there are other reasons why you might not be able to. So, for example, the guest OS or virtual appliance type might not be supported on AWS, in which case it's not possible to move it. There could be application license agreements that prevent you from doing that, or there could be license restrictions in the software that mean that you need to reactivate or reapply a license. And this is particularly the case if your license is based on the characteristics of the virtual hardware. So when you migrate to AWS, the virtual machine type will change and the virtual hardware will change, and it can invalidate some types of licensing. Also, if you have any management agents or software that you use for managing your existing infrastructure on-premise, sometimes the quality of this software is not great, and you have problems both with installation and removal. So if you're uninstalling agents which interact with hardware appliances within your network, such as your storage system, or with physical server infrastructure, then removing or leaving that application code on your VMs on AWS could actually cause you some problems. And the final thing is about if you have any high availability in your applications as they are at the moment, because the way that you provide HA services for that application might be different in AWS. So if you're, in particular, if you're using some form of Windows clustering or other type of clustering, you could be depending on shared volumes, and these are not natively available in AWS. So the way that you need to provide that high availability functionality would be different. And in this case, you need to look specifically at how you provide that high availability option on AWS, and it could involve you needing to use a replatform exercise, reinstalling components in a different manner, or using a different type of clustering option. Another great reason for not using a straightforward VM migration is actually when you do that, you may not be taking advantage of the cloud services in a cost-effective manner. As a general principle of migration, the more you actually move towards native AWS services like Lambda functions or RDS databases, the more value that you'll realize from the migration. And one of the key reasons for this is that you actually can reduce the cost and size of the billing units that you're using for your capacity by re-architecting your application to use the native services. But you can also increase the capability and speed at which your application can scale out or scale back in so that you can actually cost manage your application based on usage. And the ability to increase the availability of your services. So to provide a higher level SLA is also something you need to factor in when you're migrating to AWS. Because if you're using the native services, there's a certain level of high availability built in already. If you're using, if you're abstracting away from the hardware, so you are building something on VMs, then you need to build those high availability services yourself, and you need to look at how the application is actually managing that. So if you simply lift and shift your virtual machines to AWS, even if you rebuild them, if you're not utilizing things like auto-scaling, you're not powering down instances when they're not in use, or you're not optimizing the instance sizes based on their usage, then you're not going to get great value out of AWS services. If you're always oversizing your VMs, if you're leaving VMs that you're not using on 24/7, and if you're just keeping a fixed capacity when you're not utilizing that capacity, then you're going to be overcharged because you're paying for those services based on their consumption. So once you've decided to migrate your service to AWS, there are a number of tools that are available to actually help you in that migration process. And these tools fall into three main categories. You have your server migration tools, your unstructured data tools, and your structured data tools. So when we look at our server migration tools, we have the option of the AWS Server Migration Service, and this allows us to import existing virtual machines and then bring them into AWS. And you also have a tool called Cloud Engine, which is actually now an AWS product since it was purchased by AWS. And this actually allows you to keep VM services online and actually migrate services online. So you can keep the virtual machines up and it syncs in the background, and then you can switch over with a very small outage window when you migrate from on-premise to AWS. You also have a number of unstructured data services. So you have AWS Data Sync, which allows you to sync file data from on-premise to AWS. You have AWS Snowball appliances, or you have Snowmobile. And what these are devices or trucks that you can wheel up to your data center, copy the data to those devices, and then you ship those devices to AWS. And AWS is a service for managing the import of that data into Amazon S3. And from Amazon S3, then you can move that data into your environment. And then there's also the option of the AWS Storage Gateway. The AWS Storage Gateway is an appliance that you, again, plug into your data center, or you run as a VM within your data center. And what it does is it effectively acts as a storage appliance, like a NAS or SAN appliance, and you can use that to act as like a local connectivity. So you can mount servers from the storage gateway, and data is cached locally, and then the rest of the data is synced to AWS in the background. You can also use the AWS storage gateway as a virtual tape library, so you can send your backup data to AWS in that form as well. In terms of structured data tools, you have the AWS Database Migration Service, which allows you to migrate data from databases that you might have on-premise or in other clouds, or even from other types of databases that you're hosting in AWS. And it can actually perform conversion between different database engines. So if, for example, you wanted to migrate from Oracle to PostgreSQL, the AWS Database Migration Service can actually manage that and syncing between the two databases. And then there's finally the tool AWS Glue. And AWS Glue is like a pipeline tool that you can use to transform a database between one source to another. So you can use it both with database data or streaming data to another database engine or another streaming source, but you can also use it to transform to and from flat files. So you can turn a database into a JSON format or JSON formatted data into a database. So this tool is very flexible and versatile. So we're just now coming towards the end of our webinar, and I hope that we've been able to lift a little bit on the process of migrating to AWS and giving you some food for thought about your future aspirations. I just wanted to give a little overview of Basefarm and talk a little bit about us and our experience. So we as a company, we work for a number of top-tier brands and corporations, and you can see a little list of them on screen there in front of you, and they cover a number of different industry sectors. We're actually a AWS advanced partner, so we have a number of specialities with AWS, and we're able to help you with anything that we've talked about today. So we hope that if we have stoked your interest and you're interested in finding out more about migrating to AWS, that you'll give us a call and contact us. Right here. Thank you very much. And you can see our contact details below, and you can also use the response and communications channel available at the bottom of your screen. So thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, and we hope to see you again in the future.